I call Kevin Haig.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. Had to refresh my memory of what this bill was about. It seems to have taken a very, very long time to come back. And interestingly, the first part of the bill that deals with the powers of medical officers of health and modernises that regime actually largely drew those sections from the public health bill. And when I was refreshing my memory about this bill, I noted that in my first reading speech, I spoke about the fact that public health bill was reported back to the House on the 26th of June 2008. And at the time of the first reading of this bill, the Health Protection Amendment Bill, the public health bill stood at number 34 on the order paper. In other words, towards the lower end of the government's priorities. Modernising public health legislation wasn't a priority, sir. And if it wasn't a priority then, it's even less of a priority now because the bill has now entirely disappeared from the order paper. So the other changes that were intended with the public health bill presumably now are lost to this parliament, at least until there's a change of government, sir. Jackie Dean, in her contribution just now, put her finger on something that has always puzzled me, which is how did it come to be that these powers of medical officers of health in relation to communicable diseases were placed in the same bill that actually dealt with the regulatory regime that should apply to sunbeds, because these two matters actually relate to quite different types of control. And if one were to be regulating sunbeds, there are some other matters that could also be regulated at the same time if one took an objective perspective on controlling some of the risks of non-communicable disease to New Zealanders. And one thinks particularly, for example, of the food environment, for example, sir. So I have had a very interesting personal experience in my work career that relates to the issue of powers of medical officers of health, sir. When I was the Chief Executive of the New Zealand AIDS Foundation, I had to deal with a couple of situations where we had become aware of a person who had HIV who was engaging in multiple and frequent behaviours that posed a risk of transmitting that HIV to other people. And no amount of conversation with these two people seemed able to change their behaviour in any way. And so, Mr Speaker, on that occasion, I sought advice from the Ministry of Health and said, well, what are the measures that the ministry could recommend to me that I could take that would reduce the risk of transmission to other people? And the ministry took a while to provide some advice, and the advice that it provided in the end was fairly equivocal. But what it amounted to was that the one power in law was that medical officers of health have, since the Health Act is one of those very long-standing pieces of legislation, sir, pretty sweeping powers that aim to detain people indefinitely with very little in the way of checks and balances on their human rights. And that's about it. That was the power that was available under New Zealand law. And so since that time, sir, I've been a very strong advocate for modernising that provision because while that provision might be necessary in the most extreme case, there are many less extreme cases in which some degree of exercise of power by the medical officer of health would seem to be appropriate and necessary, without going to that length, and while retaining greater recognition of the human rights and indeed civil rights of the individual whose liberty or freedom is in some way being constrained. So, Mr. Speaker, I had some significant involvement in the drafting of the section or the clauses that appeared in the Public Health Bill, and so it was some sadness that I saw that bill languishing, and some relief more than pleasure that I see this bill finally moving through its third reading and becoming law today, sir. I want to say a little bit about sunbeds, because the decision made by the government to retain sunbeds and restrict them just on the basis of age really flies in the face of the evidence that the Select Committee heard. And it's contradictory to the conclusions that other governments have made when faced with the same evidence. The Select Committee heard some extremely powerful evidence, particularly from Consumer New Zealand. Consumer New Zealand referred to the surveys, the mystery shopper surveys that they had undertaken with the provider of these Solaria services. And what they were particularly looking for was the extent to which the regulation and the guidance that the Ministry of Health had provided for the industry was actually relayed to customers of the industry. And the answer, Mr. Speaker, is hardly at all. And Mr. Speaker, this was not just a one-off intervention on the part of Consumer New Zealand. In fact, they've held a number of such mystery shopper surveys of the industry. And I guess the government's position might be supportable if those surveys had showed some kind of progress. So perhaps not complete implementation of the regulation from the ministry, perhaps not perfect education of clients using those services, but at least improving. Mr. Speaker, it doesn't. Despite the best efforts, presumably, of the Ministry of Health, the industry is still not complying with regulation. It is still not providing information to the clients of those services that would enable them to make an informed decision, as Jackie Dean has just spoken about whether or not to use that service that actually poses to them a significant risk of skin cancer. So in a situation where consumers of a service cannot, in fact, make that judgment for themselves, they simply don't have the information, and the industry refuses to meet its obligation to provide that information, then how should a government respond, Mr. Speaker? Mr. Speaker, sunbeds offer, in almost all cases, apart from a very small number of medical uses, no actual benefit to their users, and they pose a very substantial risk that the industry is not willing to mitigate. Mr. Speaker, that is a case of market failure. That is a case where a responsible government would step in to protect its citizens, and this government should have done that.
I call Ria Bond.